Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark. I hope you're all doing well. I just come to you today with a video about a few of the things I read this week. One thing I actually finished at the beginning of the week was Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts, or the US title I believe is Napoleon the Great. I listened to this as an audiobook and it was very entertaining and very interesting and informative. It's very long. I believe the book is almost 1,000 pages. It's like 970 something pages. With the audiobook it was nice because it was broken up into 33 chapters, so I could listen to pretty much one or two a day, which I really enjoyed, and I'm kind of sad that it's over. It is very much a life of Napoleon. There are, of course, other characters in the background, but Roberts doesn't really go into any of them so much, which I suppose is understandable. I mean, there's more than enough going around more than enough for him to talk about with just Napoleon as his subject. We really delve into his life. For example, we learn that he suffered from hemorrhoids, and the treatment was a course of leeches. So I don't know if you believe in reincarnation or anything like that, but you must, it's probably bad enough to come back as a leech, but, imagine you have to come back as a leech that is set to cure Napoleon Bonaparte's hemorrhoids. He really paints an interesting picture of Napoleon as a man, and he's quite likable. At least I think so. He's extremely interesting. I mentioned in the previous video when I was talking about the fact that I was listening to this that he was a big micromanager, which he was, and it's just incredible, really, the life he led. The chapter on the retreat from Moscow is extremely graphic and dark and pretty horrific. It's one of those things I know about, but I didn't know a lot of detail about it. It's incredible. Obviously, I suppose, given his penchant for war and making war, it's not surprising that he lost so many friends, but of course he did. And the book comes to an end pretty much with, or Napoleon's career rather, comes to an end with Waterloo. But the most interesting part for me of this book was the last chapter, dealing with his exile to the island of Saint Helena. If you're not sure where Saint Helena is, I shall show you right now. So yeah, he arrived on Saint Helena, and it's just a fascinating insight to his life there. I thought I'd read a little bit of it to you. On October 17th, the prevailing southeasterly wind blew violently. Napoleon disembarked and was taken briefly to Longwood, the house that was being made ready for him on the Deadwood Plateau. Longwood had been the lieutenant governor's residence, but he had stayed there for only 3 months of the year because its elevation of 1,500 feet above sea level meant that it had, and still has, a microclimate different from the rest of the temperate tropical island. British officials who had lived on St. Helena could legitimately call the island's climate perhaps the mildest and most salubrious in the world. Wellington, who had visited in 1805 on his return from India, wrote the climate apparently the most healthy I have ever lived in. But these visitors had mostly remained in or around Jamestown. Longwood, by contrast, lies in cloud for over 300 days a year. The humidity is typically 78%, but often reaches 100%. Everything is therefore slightly but constantly damp, even the wallpaper. The trees, bent over from the wind, all have lichen growing over them. Napoleon's playing cards had to be dried in the oven to stop them sticking together. Longwood also had infestations of termites, rats, midges, mosquitoes and cockroaches, the last three of which it still has today, despite the fine work done by the resident honorary French consul Michel Danquasne-Martineau to restore and maintain the residence. The clammy humidity throughout the September, February, summer months meant that Napoleon and his entourage constantly suffered from bronchitis, catarrh and sore throats. But other than the governor's mansion, less than 3 miles away, it was the only place large and secluded enough to house the former emperor and his suite of courtiers and servants, and its prominence on the plateau made it easier to guard from the nearby Deadwood barracks. A flagged telegraph station at Longwood told the governor what Napoleon was doing, with 6 possibilities from all is well with respect to General Bonaparte to General Bonaparte is missing. So yeah, I suppose he's lucky to have escaped, execution, which maybe he would have undergone had he been taken by Austria or Russia. But the British decided the best thing was to kind of put him out of the way on this really remote island. But it doesn't seem all bad, although he does, of course, eventually die there. I think he's there for 5 or 6 years before the illness that he suffers from takes him. But as I say, it doesn't seem all bad, and there's a really sweet part that I liked, which I'll also read to you. In the 7 weeks that it took for Longwood to be refurbished and extended, Napoleon stayed at a pretty bungalow called the Briars, closer to Jamestown, with the family of the East India Company superintendent, William Balcombe, where he had 1 room and a pavilion in their garden. This period was his happiest on St. Helena, not least because he struck up an unlikely, charming and innocent friendship with the second of the Balcombes' 4 surviving children, Betsy, a spirited 14-year-old girl who spoke intelligible, if ungrammatical, French, and to whom Napoleon behaved with avuncular indulgence. She had originally been brought up to view Napoleon, in her words, as a huge ogre or giant, with 1 large flaming eye in the centre of his forehead, and long teeth protruding from his mouth, with which he tore to pieces and devoured little girls. But she very soon came to adore him. His smile and the expression of his eye could not be transmitted to canvas, and these constituted Napoleon's chief charm, she later wrote. His hair was dark brown, and as fine and silky as a child's, rather too much so indeed for a man, as its very softness caused it to look too thin. The friendship began when Napoleon tested Betsy on the capitals of Europe. When he asked her the capital of Russia, she replied, "Petersburg now, Moscow formerly," upon which he turned abruptly around, and fixing his piercing eyes full in my face, he demanded sternly, "Who burnt it?" She was dumbstruck, until he laughed and said, oui, you know very well that it was I who burnt it." Upon which the teenager corrected him, "I believe, sir, the Russians burnt it to get rid of the French." Whereupon Napoleon laughed, and friendship with Mademoiselle Betsy, or Little Monkey, Bambina, and Little Scatterbrain was born. They sang songs together, and would march around the room tunelessly humming the air, Vive Henri IV. "I never met with anyone who bore childish liberties so well as Napoleon," recalled Betsy. "He seemed to enter into every sort of mirth or fun with the glee of a child, and though I have often tried his impatience severely, I never knew him lose his temper or fall back upon his rank or age." Staying with the Balcombes, Napoleon spent his time playing chess, billiards, whist with Betsy for sugar plums, and other children's games. Also, he took part in pistol marksmanship and relaying island social gossip. He spent many hours in hot baths, watching the clouds as they rolled towards Longwood, listening to the 1,000 crickets after sunset, and riding in his jaunting Irish carriage at breakneck speeds along the island's few but vertiginous roads. Freed of responsibility, he allowed himself a good deal of levity, almost a second childhood. When Betsy's brother Alexander called him by his British nickname Boney, he didn't understand the allusion, especially after Lacasse interpreted it literally. He pointed out what was by then all too obvious: "I am not at all bony." So yeah, it's a fantastic book, and I was kind of thinking it was a solid, 4-star read until I got to this final chapter, and reading about his life there in St. Helena, it just fascinated me. So I upped it to a five-star review, and I would recommend it to anyone, just as a general biography, or especially if you are interested in Napoleon and the Napoleonic era. If you've read War and Peace, that kind of thing, you'll probably really enjoy this book. It's long, but I think you can kind of really dip in and out of it, or as I did, get the audio book and just listen to a chapter or so a day. So yeah, that was one of the things I read this week. I'm reading another biography of sorts, which is about George Washington, and it's called Travels with George, in Search of Washington and His Legacy, by Nathaniel Philbrick. And so far this is very good. Philbrick kind of talks about, what's his name? John Steinbeck's travels with Charlie, and he does a similar thing. He travels around the area of the original 13 colonies of the United States, following in the footsteps of George Washington, kind of like in the progress he made while he was president. So they visit various parts of New England, and then they embark on like a 3-month tour of the South, and it has some humorous moments. Philbrick does it with his wife and his dog Dora, who's a young puppy, and she's a very special kind of dog, from Canada, and I can't remember her breed actually offhand. I'll have to try and check that out. Ah yes, there it is. She's a duck-tolling retriever. He says in the book, "A word about Dora, the duck-tolling retriever. The term tolling comes from the Middle English word tollen, meaning to attract or entice, such as church bells to lure parishioners. Since time immemorial, foxes have been known to attract ducks by cavorting on the water's edge, even rolling onto their backs with their bushy white-tipped tail in the air. A curious duck swims to the shore, and the fox pounces on its prey. Nova Scotia's original inhabitants, the Micmacs, might have been the first to train their dogs to imitate this behaviour, but it was the French who settled in what they called Acadia in the early 17th century who made the first recorded reference to the decidedly fox-like little dog that would become the Nova Scotia duck-tolling retriever." So that's the type of dog that Dora is, and she seems really a lovely thing. I'm only about 4 chapters into the book, but it's very interesting. I've already learned a lot about Washington that I didn't know already, which wasn't that much, to be honest. I didn't know, for example, as well as being father of his nation, he was also father of American mules. I think it was the Spanish and somebody else. They kind of kept kind of a hold or monopoly on mules. You know, is it half horse, half donkey animal? They would keep their breeding stock of donkeys for this very close to their chest, and Washington thought it would be very important to have them because they're very durable animals. So he was able to secure a gift of these donkeys for breeding purposes. So American mules that were so useful within the American army, all the way up, I believe, he says, all the way up till Afghanistan, back in the early part of this century, all stem from a program launched by George Washington. The other thing that was interesting, if a bit grim, was the fact that, Washington had really good health apart from his teeth, and he suffered terribly with them. And he underwent a new procedure at that time called the tooth transplant, which is as bad as it seems. Basically, a dentist removes the rotten tooth from the person who's suffering, and then takes a healthy tooth from somebody else. Now, normally they paid for these teeth, and they would have like the people willing to sell their teeth lining up. They would take out the first one, and they would try and fit it in. If it didn't fit, they'd move on to the next person. But each time the person's getting paid. However, in Washington's case, it was a bit, well, it was much worse than this, because of course he was a slave owner, and he, I think, had the teeth from 9 slaves implanted in his mouth. He did pay them, although I'm not sure how much choice they had in the matter, and he certainly paid them well below the market rate, which of course is very controversial. When they looked at Washington's false teeth, he had all sorts in there. So there were human teeth, there were animal teeth, and even hippopotamus ivory. And apparently the jaw on them was like spring loaded, so the default was open. So if he just relaxed, his mouth would always be, open like that. So he had to consciously clamp his mouth shut to keep it shut, and that gave him a kind of forbidding expression, made him look rather dour and grim and determined, whereas actually he's just basically trying to keep his mouth shut. And there are a few other sides in there. He talks about, because they're following the route and stuff, he stops at different places, at some guest houses, and he relates a story of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, who are also on the road together, and they come to this guest house, and there's only one room, and in that room there's only one bed, and they have to share it, and they get into an argument about whether or not the window should be open, because Franklin believes it's healthy to have, the fresh air coming into the room, whereas John Adams was of the opinion that these nighttime miasmas and noxious fumes and stuff would cause bad health. So far, I'm really enjoying this, and it's nice to kind of listen to two audiobooks about two very great military figures, as well as politicians in their own countries. I'm going to leave it for there. There are a couple of other things I've finished, but I'll talk about in another video. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care, everybody. All the best. Bye.